Senior Marshal Brother Gao, the portly young man called out in an alarmed voice, and the fear in his eyes became even more pronounced. A cold smile appeared on Han Li's face as he flew directly toward the young man, with translucent light flashing from his glabella. The portly young man immediately flew away as a streak of crimson light in a blind panic, and he was in such a hurry to escape that he had even abandoned his pair of curved dagger immortal treasures. The streak of crimson light vanished into the distance in the blink of an eye, and Han Li immediately stopped in his tracks upon seeing this, choosing not to give chase. All of a sudden, his complexion became extremely pale, and he was panting heavily as he drifted back down onto the ground. There wasn't much immortal spiritual power left in this body to begin with, and it had been virtually completely exhausted, while Han Li was unleashing his spirit sense cage on the elderly man. So if the portly young man had fought back, then he would have been completely powerless to resist. Thankfully, the young man had a very cowardly personality, and he immediately fled the scene at the slightest show of intimidation. Han Li flipped a hand over to produce an immortal origin stone that he held in his hand to recover his immortal spiritual power. And at the same time, he pointed a finger forward, mustering up what little remained of his immortal spiritual power to shoot a beam of black light out of his fingertip, which pierced through the tall, elderly man's head. The elderly man's head instantly exploded, and his headless body toppled to the ground. After doing all of that, Han Li also slumped to the ground, feeling completely spent. Now that the immediate threat had been dealt with, he was finally able to take a look at his surroundings, and he discovered that this yellow desert was rather similar to the setting that he had seen in that water droplet. After sitting in silence for a short while, Han Li looked up to discover a mantra treasured axis projection hovering above his head, and at this point, only a small portion of its 720 time Tao runes had faded. He closed his eyes as he carefully sensed the circulation of the enormous spiritual sense in his mind, experiencing the feeling of the fifth level of the spirit refinement technique while also examining the memories of the body that he had possessed. As it turned out, the black-robed man's name was Xianxia, and he was a reincarnation disciple of the Reincarnation Palace. In contrast with Han Li, he was a true reincarnation disciple, granting him access to a vast array of the Reincarnation Palace's cultivation resources. However, in return, he had to periodically complete missions released by the Reincarnation Palace. It was during one such mission that Xianxia had come to this place, which was called the Open Origin Immortal Region, and he was ambushed by 5 immortal envoys of the Heavenly Court, thereby leading to his demise. Han Li really wanted to know more about the Reincarnation Palace, so he closely examined Xianxia's memory fragments, and a long while later, he raised his head with slightly furrowed brows. Most of Xianxia's memory fragments contained cultivation information that was useless to him, and Han Li was only able to find very little information about the Reincarnation Palace. Xianxia had already been a reincarnation disciple for over 2 million years, but he was a cultivation fanatic who was constantly cultivating in seclusion in his cave abode, very rarely coming out to go anywhere. Even though he was a reincarnation disciple, he had no intention of becoming excessively involved with the Reincarnation Palace. He had carried out many Reincarnation Palace missions, but never had he met any of the Reincarnation Palace's leading figures. The person that he came into contact with the most was a reincarnation envoy who served as the contact between him and the Reincarnation Palace. Aside from that, there was no other information pertaining to the Reincarnation Palace. Han Li shook his head before raising his head to look up at the mantra treasured axis projection once again. And at this point, over a quarter of the time Tao runes on its surface had already faded. After a brief moment of contemplation, Han Li rose to his feet, then made his way over to the body of the tall elderly man, before tracking down his storage tool. He then strode over to the other 3 bodies and collected their storage tools as well. After that, he sat down and placed the 4 storage tools on the ground in front of himself, along with Xianxia's storage ring, then began to examine their contents one by one. All 5 of these deceased cultivators had been at the high zenith stage, so they were extremely wealthy, and their storage tools contained enormous numbers of immortal origin stones, as well as many immortal treasures, materials, and pills of an extremely high caliber. Unfortunately, there was no way that Han Li could take these things with him, so he began focusing on things that could be of use to him. Moments later, a small pile of items appeared on the ground in front of him, consisting mostly of some scriptures and jade slips, as well as a golden disc, a golden badge, and a white plate. Han Li picked the golden disc and the white plate for a brief examination, then set them down before picking up the golden badge. He had seen both of these items in Gong Shuju's storage tool before. The golden disc was the item that was used for communication between immortal envoys, while the white plate was what they used to detect the aura of the spirit refinement technique. As for the golden badge, that appeared to be an identity badge, and each one of the 4 armor-clad figures had one in their possession. There was a beautiful dragon engraved onto the edge of the badge, and on one side was engraved the character for prison, while the other side carried a number. Han Li briefly inspected the badge for a moment, then quickly set it aside before turning his attention to the scriptures and jade slips, most of which contained cultivation arts and secret techniques. These were naturally all very remarkable cultivation arts, given that they were part of collections of high zenith cultivators, and they were certainly very eye-opening for Han Li. Even though he still had time, he didn't want to spend too much of it here, so he quickly flipped through the scriptures one after another, making no attempt to memorize their contents. All of a sudden, he spotted a gray jade slip, which contained a pill recipe as opposed to any cultivation art or secret technique. The recipe was for a pill by the name of the Vajra Iron Bone Pill, and it contained the laws of metal, able to enhance the consumer's physical constitution while also aiding in the mastery of the laws of metal. Han Li took a glance at the mantra treasured axis projection above his head to find that only less than half of its time dial runes remained lit. He then withdrew his gaze before taking some time to memorize the pill recipe, following which he tossed the jade slip aside before continuing to check through the other items. It didn't take long before he had examined all of the scriptures and jade slips, and he swept a sleeve through the air to stow them away, then picked up the 5 storage tools before flying away into the distance. Shortly thereafter, he descended onto an oasis in the desert, at the center of which was a small lake. He swept a sleeve through the air once again to release a burst of black light that enveloped the storage tools, carrying them to the lake bed before burying them. After that, he sat down beside the oasis with his legs crossed and continued the experience, the intricacies of the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique. He hadn't closely examined the contents of the storage tools, as he wanted to dedicate as much time to experiencing the spirit refinement technique as possible. As time slowly passed by, the time dial runes on the mantra treasured axis projection faded one after another, and as the final time dial rune turned dark, the axis projection suddenly turned a black color, then transformed into a vortex. A burst of tremendous suction force surged out of the vortex, and Han Li's soul was sucked into it without being able to pose any resistance. Once again, his consciousness faded, and some time later, he slowly opened his eyes, upon which he discovered that he had returned to his cave abode. The heaven-controlling vial was still hovering in midair, but the green light that it was giving off was rapidly fading, and in the end, it returned to its original size before falling down from above. Han Li reached out to catch the vial, then briefly examined it before injecting his spiritual sense into it, trying to contact the vial spirit that he had caught a brief glimpse of. However, despite his best efforts, he was unable to garner any response from the vial spirit, and it was as if it had fallen into a slumber once again. Han Li could only heave a resigned sigh before stowing the heaven-controlling vial away. After that, he flipped a hand over to produce a jade slip, then transferred the Vajra Iron Bone Pill recipe that he had memorized onto it so that he wouldn't forget it. After stowing the jade slip away, Han Li took a deep breath before closing his eyes once again. During this instance of spiritual transmigration, he had been transported into that mysterious space and witnessed that mysterious river, which had left him with many questions. It seemed that the scenes flowing through the river depicted the history of certain people. It appeared that all of these people had already died or were on the brink of death, and by possessing their bodies, Han Li was able to examine some of their memories and learn some things. As for whether he could choose which target he could possess, that was something that he would have to examine next time. The problem was that with each spiritual transmigration, all of the time Tao runes on his mantra treasured axis would be snuffed out, and even though they were currently able to recover far faster than before, it would still take quite a bit of time for a full recovery. The main reward that he had reaped from this instance of spiritual transmigration were the cultivation insights pertaining to the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique that he had gleaned from Xianxia. With these newly gained insights, he was confident that he would be able to make far faster progress in his cultivation of the 5th level of the spirit refinement technique. Right as he was about to begin cultivating, he suddenly opened his eyes before casting his gaze outside. A ball of white light had flown in from outside the cave abode, and it circled around in Han Li's secret chamber momentarily before suddenly shattering. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this, and he rose to his feet before deactivating the surrounding restrictions, then made his way out of his secret chamber. The gate of the cave abode was open to reveal a gray-robed elderly man standing outside. The man had a goatee on his chin, and he had a rather snide and sneaky appearance. Han Li faltered slightly at the sight of the elderly man, then smiled as he said, "Long time no see, fellow Taoist Lu." The elderly man was Lu Guanzi, who lived in the nearby Sunny Valley, and he got along very well with Taoist Master Jingyang and Immortal Lord Hot Flame, regularly paying them visits, so over time, Han Li had also become well acquainted with him. "Please pardon my intrusion, fellow Taoist Li," Lu Guanzi said with a smile. "Come in. What brings you here today?" Han Li asked as he made an inviting hand gesture. "It's all right. Let's just talk here," Lu Guanzi refused with a faint smile.